Senator Marco Rubio, thank you for the interview and welcome to the program.
Thank you.
U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson says that there won't be any normal relations with Russia because of the situation in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine. Does it mean that the U.S. government regards Russia as an enemy?
I wouldn't. The Russian people are not our enemy, and certainly Vladimir Putin's government behaves like an adversary in many theaters and in many places. It's regrettable. I think that a partnership between the United States, the American people, and the Russian people would benefit both peoples and would be great for the world. But the direction that Vladimir Putin has chosen to take Russia has made that very difficult to achieve. And Ukraine and Crimea, and before that Georgia, are examples of things that he does that put him at odds with what the world thinks is the right thing to do, and certainly what the United States thinks is the right thing to do. And so while we must always deal with the Russian government because of the realities of geopolitics, we don't need to do so at the expense of the rights of our fellow man and the Russian people's desire to live in a free, pluralistic, democratic society where their rights are respected. And we also don't have to do that by abandoning the rights of the people in Ukraine and in other Georgia and in other places from having their territorial integrity respected.
There's gonna be a detailed report on Russian oligarchs and senior Russian officials who are involved in foreign policy, and this report will be presented before the beginning of February next year. What are your expectations?
My expectation is that they'll confirm, if the report is done appropriately and accurately, what we've long known, and that is that Vladimir Putin long ago made the decision that his role was to place Russia once again in the world as a great power, an alternative to the United States and to the international order, which in and of itself is not a terrible ambition, but the way he's chosen to do it internally is by controlling media and controlling industry. And so you see how he has placed loyalists and people whose income and standard of living is dependent upon his willingness to allow them to benefit from his power. So I think the reports will show that there is a group of elite oligarchs in Russia that control the nation's wealth because of their relationship with Vladimir Putin, and in exchange they're his agents around the world that he uses for his own purposes, both financial and political.
And who is at risk? Because in Russia everybody, all these wealthy people or oligarchs, they're really nervous. Who is at risk?
Well, I would say the report will speak for itself, so it's not an appropriate thing to stand out beforehand and name names. Let the report stand there. Suffice it to say that I imagine people are nervous and should be nervous, because while I'm not saying it's impossible and that there aren't people that have not done anything wrong and have been financially successful, it is very difficult, if not near impossible, to be a billionaire or a multi-millionaire in today's Russia without the blessing, the acquiescence, and the support of Vladimir Putin. He decides who gets to make the money, and that's directly proportional to his ability to control you and your willingness to work on his behalf and be his agent and not disrupt what he has set up for himself, which is his vision of a new czar.
But what will be the consequences for those people who will appear on this list?
Well, I think their consequences with regards to the United States policy is that their access to both their finances and their visits to the United States could be curtailed or eliminated. They could lose visas. They could lose the ability to access resources here in the United States. I think that would be one of the consequences that you could see on behalf of the U.S. government. We'll see how the rest of the world reacts.
U.S. President Donald Trump makes headlines here in the United States and in the world because of his Russia connections. What might be the final political consequences for President of the United States in the aftermath of all these investigations?
Well, the one thing about here and compared to Vladimir Putin's government is that we have a system of checks and balances and we have a system of rule of law. And so right now there's suspicions and allegations that have been made, and they're being investigated by professional investigators who will make decisions based on the facts. If there's nothing there, there's nothing there. And if there is, well, then we'll see where that leads us. And that's ongoing. So I think ultimately we'll let that play itself out and we'll go wherever the truth takes us, because that's the way our system works. and people that are accused have a right to defend themselves and or prove their innocence, and the government has a burden to prove that, and we're not at that stage here. But what I think is abundantly clear is that Vladimir Putin chose to interfere in the US elections, not so much to favor one candidate over another, in my opinion, but to sow instability, to sow, I think in many ways he blames the United States for the protests against corruption and against him that took place in 2010 and 2011 and 2009, and in the later part of the last decade, early part of this decade. He thinks somehow the United States was behind it, and in many ways this was a part of getting revenge for that. And I think the other part of it is, quite frankly, he wanted to destabilize the US Republic and be able to go back and say to his own people and to the world that America's in no position to lecture anyone about democracy. Their own democracy is flawed, which I don't necessarily disagree that we're not perfect. There's no doubt that we're not perfect. The difference is that our imperfections are debated openly in a free society and not presented through a state-controlled media loyal to one person and one regime.
But I'm talking about these exact investigations. If they prove that Trump had connections with Russia, what would be the consequences for him, for his political career? What the risk of impeachment, for example?
Well, we're way ahead of ourselves when talking about words like impeachment and things that we're not at that stage or anywhere close to it. Right now we have an investigation ongoing, and it may lead to nothing. It may lead to certain individuals. We've already seen a couple of indictments, but it may not ultimately prove anything that the president did anything wrong. And so we need to wait for that. I don't want to prejudge that, and it would be unfair and prejudicial to do it. But ultimately, I have confidence in the people that are doing this investigation, are serious and professional people. The truth is going to be out there for our courts to look at in the case of the individuals that have been indicted or may be indicted, and for the voters to look at in the case of anybody else who's in an elected office. So we need to wait for all of that. Anything that gets ahead of it wouldn't be fair to the accused and wouldn't be fair to the truth. So we've got to wait for that process to work itself out. The important thing is we have a process, and that process will lead us to facts and will lead us to truth. And then both voters and our court system can make decisions based on that.
And what, in your estimation, what is the real impact of Russia on the presidential election here in the United States?
I don't think it impacted the outcome. But we most certainly need to be aware that foreign governments tried to exploit legitimate divisions in American society for purposes of creating chaos. I think Vladimir Putin's ultimate goal was not the election of one candidate versus another, although he may have personally preferred one candidate. But I think his ultimate goal was to ensure that whoever was elected the next United States president did so with their credibility damaged. And I also think he wanted to exploit what were already existing divisions in American society for purposes of forcing us to go through what we're going through right now, which is investigations, divisive debates, talk about impeachment and the like. It's destabilizing. And this is a pattern that has repeated itself not simply in the US elections. We saw an attempt to do it in France and in Germany and Montenegro and Bulgaria most recently, and potentially even now in Mexico this year. This is a sort of hybrid warfare type concept that he has adopted, and it's in line with his training as a KGB officer and the sort of propaganda efforts that existed during the Cold War without the internet and without Twitter and Facebook.
You're talking about propaganda, and I have a question about propaganda. Russia Today played a role in the presidential election, according to the reports that were published. Russia Today has been recently recognized or labeled as foreign agent, and it lost its accreditation in the Congress. Do you support
I do, because they're not a legitimate news agency. They are controlled by a government agency of another country. But I would go further and say that almost all press in Russia is. One of the things Vladimir Putin learned in the late 1999, 2000, 2001 period was he needed to control the media. He could no longer allow there to be media voices that were dissenting from him, and that's what he's done. He knows that the access to information gives them power. And so today you see in Russia, the Russian people, and you see these public opinion polls, and you're not surprised by it, because the information they're being fed is wrong. Anybody who opposes the Putin regime is characterized as an outsider, an alien, somebody who isn't, whose values are different from the rest of the country, so there's no space for legitimate dissent. They lie about the presence of Russian troops in Ukraine when there was clear reality that they were there. They lie about what's happening in Syria and the role the United States has played. And so when a country and a people only have access to sources of information controlled by those in power, the information they're going to get isn't necessarily based on truth, and there's no access to alternative. And by the way, I don't think it's a coincidence that the recent, few months ago, the protests in Russia against corruption were largely led, historically in Russia, protests have been led by older working class folks. In this case, the protests were by younger people who consume information on the internet, not through the state-controlled propaganda in Russia. So there's no doubt that RT is an agent of influence. The U.S. has television and radio stations abroad, but we don't deny that that's what they are. Voice of America, you know, Free Europe, Office of Cuba Broadcasting. We admit that those are media entities that the U.S. government does for purposes of disseminating information that we believe is truthful. In the case of Russia, they pretend that, in the case of Putin, he pretends that RT is a legitimate news agency. It is not. It is a propaganda arm of Russian intelligence and the Putin government.
Pentagon will receive an unprecedented budget to resist Russian aggression. It's $4.6 billion. And also it is implied by this budget that Ukraine will get lethal defensive weapons. Do you support?
I do,
this
and I know that. Yeah, I do support it. And someone who I think would understand this concept very well is Vladimir Putin, who has often spoken publicly about the need for balance. And so what happens if there's an imbalance? What happens if two neighboring nations, there's a defense imbalance, and one nation believes that it could win an armed conflict against another? That's an invitation for aggression. And so from our point of view, it is important that our allies in Ukraine and in Europe and around the world have the ability to have some level of balance, because weakness invites aggression and it invites miscalculation. And so that's what we seek, is simply to support our allies so that there can be a strategic balance that prevents war, not instigates it.
I know that you closely follow Latin America and Venezuela. Russia restructured Venezuela's debt in recent months. Why do you think, what is your assessment of Russia's role in Latin America and in particular in Venezuela?
I think it's ultimately, I mean, Putin's ability to project power globally is quite limited. At the end of the day, it's more flash than impact. In the case of Venezuela in particular, they do owe Russia money, or Russian-owned entities money. They don't have the cash to repay it, so they've been willing to restructure the payment on the debt, and they've taken as collateral resources that belong to the Venezuelan people. And they've moved away, for example, from control over Citgo and towards control of gas and oil fields instead, you know, real property outside the jurisdiction of the United States. So I think that ultimately he wants to get paid. They want to get paid, the Russian entities do, and they're hopeful that there'll be a future government in Venezuela that could do so. But my view is they probably see it that they've already invested so much in that relationship that to walk away from it, not knowing what's going to replace it, doesn't make a lot of sense. So, you know, do I think that they help the Maduro regime? And they do, but not nearly enough to save it. Beyond that, you know, places like Cuba and Nicaragua, and those are the two other places where you see the Putin government try to play a little bit of a role in basing agreements and the like. So we're aware of their presence. We certainly think that they try to use that to leverage against us a little bit, but I'm not, you know, we're concerned, but not deeply concerned about it.
President Trump introduced two major initiatives, this major tax reform that the United States haven't seen since the 80s, and his recent initiative to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Do you support both?
I do. On tax reform, again, because of our democratic nature here in this country, we have differences of opinion on what it should look like, and we're going to have a very vibrant and open debate. In a dictatorship, in a tyranny, in an oligarchy, an autocracy, those decisions are made in a closed room, and they tell you what it's going to be. They don't ask you your opinion. Here we're going to have a chance to mold it, and it won't be something I agree with 100%, but if it makes things better, it's the kind of thing I'll support. With regards to Jerusalem, I think it's offensive that Israel is the only country in the world that doesn't get to decide what its own capital is. It is most certainly its seat of government. It has been for a very long period of time. The Jewish people have a long and well-documented link to the holy city there, and I think they've been very respectful of the role that other faiths play, Christianity and Islam as well. and have continued to be committed to doing so. So I've called for that for many years, and I'm supportive of the fact that that decision was finally made.
You work with Ivanka Trump on tax relief for people with kids. What is the real influence of Ivanka Trump on her father's decisions?
Well, I think that she's a very important advocate for the concept that working families raising children face rising costs in the 21st century. And they need assistance, and they need our tax code to recognize it. And so if a company invests money in a machine, the tax code lets them keep that money. But if families are raising children, the tax code doesn't take that into account. So I'm just trying to create equality between companies and people. And she's been very supportive of that concept. So I do think that she is someone who has gotten the president and the White House to care about that issue, because it's not something he campaigned on. And so she's been an important ally in that fight.
And what's the view of the American society of the fact that President Trump brought some members of his family into the White House?
Well, it's something we haven't seen since the Kennedy administration, but by and large, I don't think that. There were a country with some diverse opinions. I think the public opinion polls in the last election reflected that we're pretty evenly divided between those that have supported the president and those that did not. It was a very close election, and he ultimately won. And I would say that of the people that have problems with President Trump, that's probably the lowest item on their list. There are a lot of other things that they oppose. And as far as the role that they've played, his family members being his son-in-law and his daughter, as I said, his daughter's had a very productive role, and his son-in-law seems to have generally as well. So I would say that even for opponents of President Trump, the presence of Jared and Ivanka in the administration is probably the least of their complaints, given some of the other things that they have problems with.
My last question is a personal question, because you introduced a legislation to designate the block in front of the Russian embassy as Boris Nemtsov Plaza in honor of my father. Why do you think it is important?
Yes, two things. One, I hope that sooner rather than later, there will be a new Russian government that will be proud that that name is on the street, not offended by it. And the second is that this is an issue, an investigation that deserves an answer. We've seen individuals that were convicted, whether it was them or not. What about why it happened? Who did it is one thing, why they did it is another. This was a political assassination. This was a prominent person in government that for many years had been a part of government, who had a difference of opinion with the direction that the country was headed under Vladimir Putin, and it cost him his life. And not only will we never know as long as Putin is in power, but they almost act like it doesn't matter. And I think that speaks not simply to the laws of a nation, but to its soul, and to what does it mean to a society when you're telling them that political opponents, it's okay to kill them. Because what does that do to a country and to its future and to its collective soul as a nation and to its identity? So this goes well beyond simply one murder. It speaks volumes to the future of a society that has some important decisions to make here over the next decade.
Senator Rubio, thank you very much.
Thank you.